Timur Kuran, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for inviting me again to your to the good fight.
Well, listen, I first read your work when I was in graduate school, and some of your classic papers were assigned as part of a comparative politics field survey. And they made a big impression on me then. And I returned to them recently when I was thinking about uh, something completely different. And I thought, this work continues to be so timely, and the way that you're thinking about how it matters today is so deep that we have to have you back on the podcast. Let's start with the kind of intuition that you started with all the way back in the 80s, which is that in retrospect, historians always think that revolutions are inevitable, and they tell you all of deep causes why any idiot should have known all along that it was about to happen. And yet, contemporaries never manage to predict that these huge upheavals are about to happen. Why is that?
So you're absolutely right that there are many massive explosions that nobody foresaw. The French Revolution is one example. There is not a shred of evidence that anyone foresaw it. The Russian Revolution of 1917 is another such example. Just several weeks before the February Revolution, Lenin was telling his an audience that the Great Revolution was something that he would never see. It would probably take decades. The Iranian Revolution of 1979, which shook the Middle East and the world, was unanticipated. The United States kept supporting the Shah until just a few days before he left. The Arab Spring came as a huge surprise, and Trump's election was something that was very poorly anticipated. Hillary Clinton was given a 93% chance in according to the poll of polls, the day before the election. Brexit came as a huge surprise. So, what is the common element in these? What causes these surprises? If if people's preferences were written on their foreheads, we could see their preferences. Everybody's preferences were political preferences. In this case, were public. We'd have no trouble seeing that more people are going to support Trump than Clinton, that people are about to take to the streets and topple the Romanov dynasty. But in fact, we are able to falsify our preferences. We are able to project a preference that is different from our private preference. That's the act of preference falsification. Preference falsification is the act of misrepresenting one's preferences under perceived social pressures. What might these social pressures be? An intellectual might engage in intellectual preference falsification because he or she senses a possibility of being ostracized, of being criticized, of being ridiculed for expressing approval of a certain theory or sharing certain interpretation. A gay person will engage in sexual preference falsification if he stays in the closet. Religious preference falsification occurs when a Jew in Spain 500 years ago pretends to be a Christian and practices Judaism secretly for fear of the Inquisition. So this is a very common phenomenon. It is universal, and it has very serious implications, very
So,
serious
so,
consequences. One of
so help
them
us think
is
through. So help us think through what the implications of that are, right? So obviously, particularly in a dictatorship, which is the canonical case, but as you're pointing out, in all these other kinds of contexts as well, we will intuitively understand why people might engage in preference falsification, right? If you're asked, what do you think of Father Stalin, and you give your honest opinion, well, that might have very immediate negative consequences, and so people are going to lie. And when you read Soviet dissidents like Václav Havel in The Power of the Powerless, which I know you cite in your work, they're thinking all about how preference falsification works and what the consequences are when people stop engaging in preference falsification. So all of that is fine. Why is it that this element of preference falsification is so central to putting in motion the social process that can lead to a political revolution, to the downfall of a dictatorial regime, which seems like it is very firmly entrenched in power? And why, in particular, can it explain this element of surprise? What is it about preference falsification that explains why, when that process takes place, it often takes people by surprise?
Because people who are falsifying their preferences do not like to do that. There's a cost to it. Now, it will vary from context to context or person to person, but there is a cost. We all would rather express our preferences honestly than falsify them. Now, if there are millions of people who dislike the regime, the reigning regime, they may be, within that society, there may be people who will abandon preference falsification, will start expressing their preferences honestly, will publicize their opposition to the regime, if only some others go first. Well, we don't know what event. The reason the big explosions come as a surprise is that we don't know exactly what it would take, what sort of stimulus it would take, what kind of trigger is necessary to get the process started, to get some people to say enough is enough. Yes.
One of the things I like about this account is that it picks up on a depressing feature of certainly life in dictatorial regimes, but perhaps even more broadly of intellectual life, even in free and democratic societies, and we'll come back to that. But it doesn't make a very negative assumption about human nature. And in that sense, I think it sort of runs parallel to someone like Thomas Hobbes, who's often misread as thinking that he sort of bakes a negative assumption about human nature into the state of nature. And that's what explains why people, why life in the state of nature is famously nasty, brutish, and short. But that's not actually what he's doing. He is using a proto-rational choice approach to talk about the kind of security dilemma you're going to face without a Leviathan, but might lead even very good, well-intentioned, moral people to enter into conflict. And what you're doing, in a sense, is to say, look, I'm not assuming that human nature is such that people like to lie and they'll do anything in order to get ahead, and they're just these pure utility maximizing machines in the kind of most simplistic way. You're saying, actually, preference falsification has a cost, right? Most people don't like having to lie about their political opinion. Most people don't like having to nod and smile at the dictator as he walks past during some parade. So they're motivated to cease engaging in preference falsification. That's actually one of the things that drives this process. But of course, whether or not they actually have the courage to reveal their real preferences depends on a whole bunch of social circumstances. So what are the social circumstances that explain whether or not people are going to start telling the truth? And why is it that, if you reveal your true preference, and your true preference is that you're actually secretly critical of a regime, why is that going to make me more likely to reveal my true preference as well?
So there's variation in courage. This is something that we see in daily life. When we look at the people around us, there are some people who are more honest, there are other people who are terrified of being criticized by the crowd that they're in. So that is just natural. That with any given uh, atrocity, there are some people who are going to speak against it, going to criticize the regime for it, or those responsible for it more readily than others. There is to your last point. Why is it that some people that numbers matter? There's safety in numbers. If I in a society where nobody is criticizing the regime, I become the first person to criticize it, it could be that no one will follow. Could be that many people, there are thousands of people, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people who will follow if only 10 people go first. But I'm left there alone. Now, and I do not know whether my taking the first step will give at least one other person the courage to be number two. And number two doesn't know whether there is at least one person among the hundreds of thousands of people who's ready to go be number three. And it could be that there's a number two, there's a number three, there's no number four. There are lots of number fives. What is the result? The three people are arrested by the regime, they're tortured, they're killed, whatever. There's a huge risk, and there's variation in the risk that people are willing to take. This is why revolutions are unpredictable. In the case of the Arab, in the case of the Arab Spring, what started it was a match that a street vendor lit to burn himself. He poured some gasoline on himself and he lit a match, self-immolated. That struck a nerve in enough Tunisians that they took to the streets, and there were so many that took to the streets that brought in tens of thousands of more, hundreds of thousands of more, and that toppled the regime. Yeah. But we don't know exactly when such a self-immolation will strike that nerve. Was Bouazizi, the Tunisian street vendor who self-immolated, was he the first person who self-immolated? No. There had been tens of other cases that did not do this, that did not have that effect. But in this case, this episode was caught on tape, it went viral, and it was just there were enough people in Tunisian society who could relate to it, who were sufficiently offended by it to get the process started. So this is why so many big political explosions catch everyone by surprise. In retrospect, why the revolution happened is overdetermined. There are many, many explanations. In Tunisia's case, there's the way public officials treated citizens. There's inefficiencies of government. There's theft. There's the reasons go on and on.
So what I like about this explanation is that social scientists like to debate about structure and agency, right? To what extent does individual agency matter, and to what extent is history predetermined by these much deeper, longer-standing structural transformations, right? And you can tell a story about the French Revolution, or you can tell a story about the election of Donald Trump in 2016 that mostly focuses on one or the other, right? And certainly the structural explanation has a lot of going for it, because if people by 1789 went pretty unhappy with the Ancien regime, it would be very unlikely that the revolution could have happened. Similarly, if in 2016 people felt that The Democratic Party represented them very well, or the Republican Party, as it had been constituted before Trump, represented them very well, then there wouldn't have been the opening for somebody like Trump to enter politics and have this, outsized effect. At the same time, when you just look at these structural factors, they somehow fail to predict these outcomes. And so there's a weird puzzle here. If these structural factors are so important, then it should actually allow us to know in retrospect what's going to happen. But what often happens is that the structural factors overpredict how often there's going to be that kind of revolution. There's a famous line about your profession, economists, which is that they've successfully predicted 10 out of the last 3 recessions. And in a similar way, if you look at structural factors, sure, of course, there's deep discontent in France in the 18th century at various stages. It wasn't clear that the deepest discontent was just before 1789. And in any case, there's lots of places where there's deep discontent and nothing happens. I'm sure there's a lot of discontent in North Korea today, but there hasn't been so far a revolution in North Korea, right? And so in order to explain that, you need these 2 additional elements. So first is what creates that spark? And that can be somebody random that goes viral, like the fruit vendor in Algeria, right? Or it can be a talented revolutionary leader who somehow manages to make people conscious how angry they are, to spread information about how angry other citizens are, who's just strategic in how they are able to galvanize the grievances that may have existed for 10, 30, 50 years before they arrived on the scene. But then the second element, which I think is really interesting, is that the specific distribution of preferences matters. That what you really need to do is this sort of revolutionary bandwagon. And there might be societies in which, on average, people are more unhappy with a regime, but the distribution of their sort of revolutionary thresholds of when they might be willing to go out into the regime just is such that it doesn't get going. But even though there's a lot of latent discontent, the couple of people who go out in the street never manage to bring everybody else out into the society. And then there might be a society in which actually there's a distribution of preferences, and some people are really unhappy with the regime, but some people are quite satisfied with the regime. But these things are distributed in such a way that once the first 10% of the population go out in the street, that activates the next 10%, that activates the next 10%, that activates the next 10%, and sort of like a prairie fire, suddenly you end up getting this kind of revolution.
And another, if I could just add to that, another that political scientists often debate is where social change comes from. Does it come from the top, from elites? Do you need a split among within the governing body, a split among elites to get a revolution started, get major social change going? Or does it come from below? Well, it can actually come from it can come from the top, it can come from the bottom, and that itself is not predictable. In the Tunisian case, it was a member of the least privileged part of society, a street vendor who couldn't pay his bills, who couldn't feed his families, that got the process started. There are, as you pointed out, in other cases, it's a leader who senses there are grievances and manages to express them in a way to convince enough people that there is a better way forward. So it can come from the top, it can come from the bottom, it can be a combination.
So I want to get in a moment to how that can help us understand social reality today within the United States, within other democracies around the world. But before we get there, tell us a little bit about the sort of debate about the origins of revolution, because I think it's an interesting side note, right? So how have people tried historically to make sense of the origins of revolutions, and what do they get wrong? How do you think that your model helps us understand those social changes better?
So historically, the historians, political scientists, economists, others tried to look at the structural factors that 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 altered society in a way that a constituency was created, a sufficiently large, a sufficiently strong constituency was created for to change society's institutions, to revolutionize society. So people look at commercial developments and changes in commerce that made merchants more powerful in England, and eventually they had to be brought into the social system. They had to be brought into parliaments. That is what major change took place. It was a redistribution of power. People look at, in the case of Iran, they look at the growing inequality that angers the working class, that repression, religious repression of Islam on the part of the repression of practicing Muslims on the part of the Shah, that angered practicing Muslims, and created another constituency ready for a revolution, ready to topple the Shah. And they will explain the toppling of the Shah as by looking at all the factors that created these two large constituencies, and that led these two constituencies to form an alliance that then took to the streets and toppled the Shah. The problem is we don't. There are many other countries where the same conditions are present. Islam was being suppressed. There were big gaps in the wealth of capital owners and workers, and no revolution occurred. So structural conditions are relevant. If they don't exist, you're not going to get a constituency. You're not going to get a lot of people who are falsifying their preferences. You're not going to get these underground movements that are waiting for an opportunity to come to the surface. Those are important, but we can't know exactly the factors that need to come together to create that spark and get the process going.
So, look, I think at this point, hopefully everybody listening and most people listening will think that's a really interesting set of insights about how political revolutions get going. That helps me understand why it's so hard to predict when they do. But the premise of it seems at first glance to be limited to authoritarian context. Of course, people are going to engage in preference falsification if saying honestly what they think about the regime might land them in jail, if going out to protest the regime might get them executed, might get them disappeared. But we live in democratic societies, right? We live in societies where you have a First Amendment, in the United States at least. We live in societies where the government is not supposed to have a right, though this is happening in some countries, to lock you up for what you say or what you tweet. So, why is it that this really interesting set of concepts that you've developed in trying to understand pre-revolutionary France, pre-revolutionary Iran, that helped to understand briefly after the appearance of your articles how the Soviet Union might have collapsed and communism across Eastern Europe. Why is it that we should think that these set of concepts are also applicable to the United States today, to the United Kingdom today, to France, Germany, or Italy today?
So when I started developing the concept of preference for falsification and working on its implications, and wrote the papers that eventually led to the book Private Truths, Public Lies, which was published in 1995. So these papers were being written in the late 80s, early 90s. I started presenting them at various universities in the United States, at conferences, and in Europe as well. And a question that I got, or a reaction that I got commonly, in the United States, also in Britain, was exactly the point that you made. The examples I used often were the case of the Eastern Bloc. This was, I should point out, this was before the early papers were before the 1989 Eastern European revolutions. They said, yes, this certainly, you can see this applies to the Eastern Bloc. There are fewer freedoms there. You can see why people are afraid to speak. There's so many dissidents that are in jail. Yes, we can see how this would apply to India. One of my examples was the caste system in India, which is held in place largely through preference falsification. But it doesn't have, people would say, what relevance is this to a free country like the United States? We have a Bill of Rights. Our Constitution gives people freedom to speak. And if somebody tries to prevent you from expressing your political opinions, we have the ACLU, civil society will be up in arms. Well, the Constitution does give us the right to speak, but it does not ensure that we will exercise that right. We have to decide whether we will exercise that right. And we may choose, even though we are free, to object to university policies today, let's say on admissions or on faculty hiring. We may be completely free under the Constitution to object to it. We may be free under the university's rules, technically free to express opposition, express misgivings about current policies, about the partisanship of universities, for example, but be afraid to exercise it. Why would a tenured professor at a university whose charter indicates that the purpose of the university is to pursue the truth and does not put limits on what truths may be pursued and expressed, why would a tenured professor refrain from speaking his or her mind? Because that professor might be afraid of being ridiculed, might be afraid of having his or her reputation damaged, which would have effects on his or her ability to publish, to get grants, to be appointed to influential committees, to be invited to give talks, and the list goes on and on. The other professors, academia, can ruin a person's career today by stigmatizing them as racist or homophobic or transphobic or whatever. So there are major costs that you may incur, even if you have every right under the law to say something, to express certain views, even if you will not, you know that you will not go to jail. But there are many punishments that society can impose on you short of you're going to jail or you're being put on trial.
So I've been thinking about your work. So I've been thinking about your work in writing an essay recently. Let me very briefly state the thesis of the essay and then puzzle through whether or not you would actually agree with it or not, which I'm recognizing as a more complicated question than I thought going into this conversation. So the point I'm making is not looking at academics, though there would be a very good case study for this as well, but at journalists. So, you have these remarkable instances in which there is a very, very clear mainstream line in journalism. There's a certain kind of thing that you have to argue and believe in order to be in good standing. One of the ones during the pandemic, for example, was to reject out of hand the lab leak theory, the theory that sort of the origin of COVID-19 may have been an inadvertent lab leak in a lab doing gain of function research that may have been set this virus free. This was loudly rejected by the most mainstream publications in the United States. Fact-checking websites like PolitiFact described this as a debunked conspiracy theory. There was even senior scientists who were kicked off of Facebook and YouTube for making arguments that the lab leak theory may in fact explain the virus. Later, a bunch of evidence started to accumulate, evidence that hasn't been conclusive, and I think the substantive question is still very much open to debate. But that there is, in fact, serious scientific reason to believe that the lab leak may have been at the origin of COVID-19. And even as this evidence was starting to accumulate, newspapers and magazines were continuing to ignore it completely. For the New York Times, this continued to be an absurd theory. And then suddenly, without there being an obvious instigating incident at that point, you have something like New York Magazine do a big story that marshals some of that evidence that had been around on social media and other platforms for a long time at that point. And the moment they do that, boom, 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 the next 3 or 4 mainstream publications rush to publish similar articles. And within a few weeks, this theory goes from being the mark of a crank conspiracy theorist who is cast out of polite society for daring to add, to more or less the mainstream opinion that this is obviously a theory that we should take seriously, right? And so the question is, how does this sudden transformation happen? And there I think, all of the things you're talking about, preference falsification, and then preference cascades, obviously is at play. Some journalists just didn't look into it very closely, but some of them started privately to say, you know what? Perhaps there is something to the lab leak theory, but nobody wanted to be the crank who's first out of the gate to talk about it. And then finally, when you realize you can talk about it, everybody else who's been holding back does so as well. And boom, this kind of thing changes. So, where I think a lot of people who distrust the media will have the impression that there must be a conspiracy going on, but there's a memo from above, right? That somebody's telling these journalists what to say. Actually, these very organic processes can both produce the taboo and the vanishing of a taboo at a seemingly arbitrary juncture. I think so far I'm assuming we're going to be agreed, right? The argument that I'm then making in the article is that in the grand debate about historiography between idealists and materialists and different kind of ists, we should actually give priority to the dinner partyist. That what actually explains what people do is them being worried about how they're going to be looked at the next dinner party. And that is a much bigger part of explaining how journalists messed up the origin of the pandemic, messed up Biden's mental state, messed up a serious scientific debate about things like cross-gender hormones. And that is what drives a lot of human behavior. But that is slightly reductive, right? Or it's slightly deflationary. It's saying what people really worry about is their social standing, is moments of social awkwardness, is trying to fit in with their peers, whereas you're emphasizing the real consequences, that even a professor may suddenly, be forced to teach at really inopportune moments, will not be able to win any scientific prizes, perhaps won't be able to get published in the journals they want to. So I'm recognizing there's a slight difference of emphasis, at least. Which of these two do you think it is? Is it that people actually respond rationally to an accurate assessment of the punishments they're going to suffer? Is it that they're dinner partyists, in my sense, or is it somewhere in between?
They're both relevant, and a dinner party is relevant partly because you want your close friends to stigmatize you. And when an academic gets stigmatized, that's going to affect their friendship. Often it does affect their friendships as well. That's part of it. There's another way in which the dinner party is relevant. Dinner party conversations give you clues about changing private opinion, what people are changes in the distribution of private preferences, in the distribution of private knowledge, what people know, how people are interpreting the world, but not necessarily saying it. That can change. If you go to dinner parties over time, and at many dinner parties, the origins of COVID comes up, and you start seeing, you're a journalist, and you start seeing a shift in the distribution of beliefs. That more and more people are beginning to consider the lab leak explanation plausible, even if they're not all convinced. That then gives you an opportunity to become not just another crank who will be dismissed and will be stigmatized, but will be somebody who suddenly starts a cascade. And that's a way of building a reputation. Every journalist, every academic, people who are running corporations are involved in politics within the corporation. They have to weigh the risks to advance, to develop a reputation. They have to weigh the risks of being alone and having no one follow, and the huge rewards that come if you are the first to stick a pin in a balloon.
So I have a friendly amendment.
Yes.
I have a friendly amendment to your theory, which is that I agree with you that the extent to which people will be willing to speak their mind, and therefore the extent to which an equilibrium proves stable, is going to depend on the rewards of either remaining an orthodox member of a current regime, or of being one of the early movers who manages to topple it. And so that's obviously one reason why, if I see a bunch of other people coming out and criticizing the regime, whether it's a classic dictatorship or whether it's a metaphorical regime in terms of a reigning taboo or a reigning opinion within media, I'm going to be more motivated to come out because I think, hey, I think this taboo is about to fall. And if it's about to fall, then I'm no longer going to suffer from speaking my mind. But here's the friendly amendment, which is different kinds of situations are going to differ in the extent to which you get payoffs from being one of the early movers. In a successful revolution, you have good reason to think that that is going to potentially come with a lot of private satisfaction if you just think of it as a deep political cause to topple the regime. And clearly, as you note, some people are very motivated by bringing about this change, intrinsically motivated. That's why they're willing to risk torture and so on in situations where there's still very little hope of bringing that about. But they may also be rewarded by the new regime, right? When the new regime gets rid of all the old civil servants, they may get a plum job in the state bureaucracy, and that may be a laudable thing. But some situations are going to give more rewards to early movers than other kinds of situations. And when it comes to journalism, one of the things that I found striking over the course of the last year is that it is perfectly fine for journalists to be wrong all along about the most important 10 questions of the last 5 years, as long as they're always wrong in the same way and at the same time as all of their colleagues. Because it means that they're never singled out, right? They got everything wrong, but so did everybody else, and so it doesn't undermine the reputation. Conversely, I've been struck by the extent to which the rewards for those people who are right are actually rather limited. That even the people who had questions about the origin of COVID early on, the people who had questions about Joe Biden's mental acuity early on, the people who had questions about a bunch of the other things that the mainstream media has really changed its track about, if you're out of the gate too early, you get marked as a crank, as an unreliable person, as somebody who has an ideological axe to grind. And even once everybody else comes to agree with you, you continue to have placed yourself outside of polite company in such a way that you don't get fully rehabilitated. Now, of course, you can sort of go off into the heterodox space, or you can go and become a conservative or whatever, and you can sort of try and seek rewards in a different kind of ecosystem, and that's one path. But when you're talking about at least you're standing within the mainstream ecosystem, I think one of the really strange features of journalism is that you get punished rather than rewarded, even if everybody else comes to agree with you on the substantive issue that first led to you being sort of pushed out of your social milieu.
So there's one other element we have to bring into the discussion, which I think will distinguish the two cases. The United States is today a very polarized society. Most societies, in fact, today are very polarized. And the people, in fact, scholars, very, very distinguished scholars, who early on pointed to not just the possible validity of the lab leak hypothesis, but who objected to certain COVID measures and gave reasons and said that the cost to closing primary schools, junior high schools, would be immense, and they weren't justified by the existing risks. Many people on the left today agree to a considerable extent that there's truth in those positions. But the people who made them early on, made them at a time when acting would have made a difference, taking them seriously would have made a difference, have not been rewarded. You're absolutely right. Why? Because they were immediately smeared as right-wing cranks, and they were deplatformed. They were unfollowed by people in the mainstream. Let's say the left, and they haven't recovered from that. Now, if we were not polarized, that wouldn't have happened. They would have been seen as the people who, even under fire, even when 95% of society was disagreeing with them, spoke what they believed to be true, they would have gotten credit for someone who had gotten it right. And the people who had gotten it wrong would have lost some reputation. The people who smeared the people who got it right would have paid a price. But in our polarized society, this doesn't happen. There are things that people on the left get right, and the people on the right are wrong. Eventually, they come around to agreeing with the leftist position. The same thing. In right-wing circles, the people on the left don't get the credit that they deserve. It can happen in both directions. So this is a problem, yes.
You've just clarified something really important for me, actually. So one way of putting this problem is that you should want the standard of evaluation of journalists to be, depending on whether a beat reporter or an opinion writer and so on, the exact question is going to be a little bit different from case to case, but something like, is this somebody who's capable of original thought and research and of expressing that to a broad public in a punchy way, such that they actually allow us to understand important things about the world, right? But in a deeply partisan society, the question that you're going to ask is more likely to be something, or at least it's a precondition. It's a first question that comes prior to that second question of, within those constraints, are they good at their job? Which is, are they reliably on the right side? Right? Are they on the side of the angels? Or are they the sort of person who might give aid and comfort to the enemy? And of course, if the first question is the one that governs you, then setting off a preference cascade is a sign of great success, is a sign of having succeeded at an unusual level. If the governing question is the second one, then, yes, okay, you set off a preference cascade. Yes, of course, we can sort of recognize that means that you can think for yourself and perhaps you've actually changed people's minds. But what it proves in answer to the most important question is that you're not reliably on our side, that you're willing to help the other side. And that is why you don't get readmitted. So it's not that you don't get readmitted because we memory hole the fact that we once had a different opinion, for that might also happen, right? It's not because we won't in any way be able to recognize that you had a point. It's that, in fact, it is true that you have demonstrated that you're not a reliable partisan. And if that's the entry ticket, then, despite your success in changing what society believes, you need to continue to be excluded.
So tribalism divides society, right? And there can be different preference dynamics within each tribe. So you will, if you are in, let's say, you are in the blue tribe, you may get tremendous credit in the blue tribe for writing the first article from within the blue tribe about the lab leak, that takes seriously the lab leak theory. You won't get any credit in the red tribe from the red tribe, because in the red tribe, people have been saying this for years, and it will be nothing new. And the red tribe will remember all the articles you wrote for several years debunking or dismissing the lab leak theory as the product of some cranks. So you won't get credit there for being the first one to awaken, to have the courage to take a risk in the blue tribe. So there are these two processes. I'm actually working on this right now, looking at preference falsification in polarized societies and how these dynamics interact. But I'm still at a very early stage.
So let's think through it together. This is fascinating. One of the things that's in the background of this conversation that obviously is right is the debate about cancel culture, right? And there's the kind of opening move that there is a kind of cancel culture within the left/the left-leaning establishment, that if you express certain kinds of views that might lead to you getting canceled. And one of the responses to that is, oh yeah, but you know what? The other side is canceling as well. They also engage in cancel culture. And so therefore, this isn't really a problem. I think the right answer to that is that is right. That because we're such a deeply polarized society, there is a left-wing cancel culture, which certainly governs the actions of anybody who is within that milieu, which extends in a complicated way from a political left to big parts of the mainstream. But there's, of course, also a cancel culture within the sort of right-wing conservative counterpublic. And that, for example, as many people there were calling on, for people who made tasteless and stupid comments after the attempt at assassinating Donald Trump to be fired, as might have been the case on the left in similar circumstances, right? Now, here's the question that I have about this, and perhaps that's exactly the thing you're thinking through at the moment. You wrote after Donald Trump was elected in 2016 that there is a possibility that a kind of preference cascade is going to lead to a really rightward shift of opinion in the United States. That perhaps partially for people revealing the real preferences they had about things like immigration for a long time, and partially because of a new kind of form of right-wing political correctness inducing others to falsify their true preferences, you might actually have a real shift in which something like, MAGA America ends up getting the support of 80% of people, some of whom are genuinely supporting it, some of whom feel that they need to pretend to support it in order to keep getting along. That clearly hasn't happened. I think we've sort of ended up doubling down on the two halves of America. But under what circumstances does it happen? right? So in what, where are examples of societies in which politics is deeply polarized, right? You have perhaps a kind of old establishment and a populist figure, or it can be a slightly different constellation. And it really cleaves society into two halves for a long time. And then suddenly one of those sides really wins, and boom, the preference falsification transforms this from a divided society with two tribes that have strong forms of preference falsification within themselves, but that really don't have one hegemonic set of pressures, to a society in which one side just wins, and now suddenly you have this hegemonic form of preference falsification that will be more reminiscent of a classic dictatorial regime, and perhaps in fact goes hand in hand with the establishment of a dictatorship. What does it take for one to turn into the other?
So I can give Turkey as an example where a massive shift did take place, and where we're seeing right now a shift in the opposite direction, back to the toward the status quo ante. But let me first comment on the United States. I think some shift has taken place. 2016 was significant. I think, if I'm not mistaken, there have been more Republican registrations than Democratic registrations since 2016. It's easy to check up. But I would say that this has happened in spite of Trump, not because of Trump. I think that Trump has certainly he is his MAGA movement. He's built a big movement, but many people who are on his side are on his side in spite of his personality. They would rather have somebody other than Trump. Sooner or later, Trump will no longer be on the American political scene. Somebody else will try to take his place as the leader of the movement. If that is a person who doesn't carry Trump's baggage, I think that the right will gain. This is, of course, very speculative. We'll have to see, but I think we can see that sort of shift. Of course, this depends also on what happens within the Democratic Party. You can have a shift in the Democratic Party toward the center. There might be a leader who manages to hold on to much of the left while appealing to a lot of moderates, who draws a lot of support from independents. This, of course, can change things. Now, to go to the case of Turkey, since from the 1920s all the way to the beginning of the 20th century, Turkey was ruled by uh, politicians more or less committed to Turkish secularism. And Turkish secularism has involved not the separation of mosque and state, but rather, to put it rather crudely, the repression of Islam, the control of Islam by the state. This generated for many, many decades a lot of resentment. That resentment led to a populist movement led by people whose main appeal was that they wanted more religious freedoms. And they wanted the state to be more responsive to openly religious people. Well, that movement brought Erdogan to power at the beginning of the 20th century. Initially, he did things that appealed to a large majority. His genuine support grew. He won elections fairly and in essentially free elections. And that is an example of a movement that appealed to hidden preferences and managed to bring hidden preferences to the surface and use that to come to power and to stay into and to solidify its power. But the pendulum has swung since that movement came to power. It did some good things. It became very repressive itself, turned Turkey effectively into a dictatorship, and their religiosity has fallen massively and is continuing to fall in Turkey. A movement is developing to re-embrace secularism in a modified form. What's been lacking is a charismatic leader of Erdogan's caliber. Once you get that charismatic leader who can unite there was an attempt at doing this to unite the opposition against Erdogan. They lost the election. It was neither free nor fair, but according to the results, they got only 48%. A charismatic leader could have won by a landslide. And I think that it's just a matter of time that this will happen. So there can be, the pendulum can swing when a movement comes to power by identifying a major source of preference falsification, and allows people to publicize their preferences on something very important to mass people. They can then create circumstances that make other people hide their preferences and eventually create a constituency that will react.
So we've been talking a lot about the different dynamics of how preference cascades happened and how that might transform a society. Let me take a step back for a second. Presumably, people find preference falsification to be painful, as you said, right? They would prefer to live in truth, as Havel intimated. So one interesting question is, what is the current regime of preference falsification, and could it flip to a seemingly opposite regime and all of those things? Another question is, what has to be in place in society, even in democratic societies like the United States, for people to have to engage in preference falsification less? So what do you think the answer to that is? How can we build a society in which hopefully people can actually be true to themselves, and as many people as possible can stop engaging in this kind of preference falsification?
Many of our leaders in the past have created institutions to incentivize people to speak truthfully. Universities traditionally, at least liberal universities, have been quite welcoming of diverse opinions. They've viewed diverse opinions, diverse ideologies as necessary for the learning process through debates among people holding different views. One learns how to be critical of whatever one reads. One learns how to carry on discussions in a civil way with people you disagree with. This is central to a liberal education. Our leaders need to reinforce those institutions which have weakened in recent decades.
Timur Kuran, thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Thank you very much for having me.